Hello, everyone. Welcome to IPWatchdog Unleashed, where each week we journey into the world of intellectual property to discuss the laws, news, policy, and politics of innovation, technology, and creativity. With analysis and commentary from industry thought leaders and newsmakers from around the world, IPWatchdog Unleashed is hosted by world-renowned patent attorney and the founder of IPWatchdog.com, Quinn, who has twice been named one of the most influential people in the intellectual property community and recognized numerous times as one of the top IP strategists in the world. Take it away, Gene.
Thanks, Renee, and welcome everyone to this week's edition of IPWatchdog Unleashed. This week, we're going to have a conversation about what a modern IP team is doing with respect to artificial intelligence, with respect to budgets, with respect to trying to do more for less as budgets are shrinking. And we have just a robust conversation, I think, for us here today. And I have two people joining me to have that conversation. First, we have Sivon Kalminov, and Sivon is the director of IP for Canon USA. And he runs essentially what is, and I'll let him talk about it more specifically and characterize it, but what I would call an in-house patent practice for Canon. He doesn't do everything, as I understand, but he does an awful lot of the patent work for Canon USA and also the Canon affiliates. Sivon, it's great to have you here joining us today.
That's good to be here, Gene. Thanks for having me.
And then also joining me is Fran Cruz, and Fran is Senior Vice President of IP Solutions for JurisStat. And those of you who have listened to the podcast for some time know that we've introduced Fran as she's going to be a regular co-host with me as we move through 2026, although our schedules kind of conspired. So this is the first episode I think we've done together in 2026, but it's great to have you here, Fran.
Yes, I'm so excited to be here. And this is a really rich topic. So I think we have a lot to cover.
Yeah, and this topic is one that you suggested that we do something on. I did a little bit of a preview of this, and I don't know that you call it a rant last week, but in my monologue, I talked about, the pressures between law firms and in-house budgets, and we're going to talk about that among many other things here today. So, Fran, maybe I'll kick it over to you to start and let the audience know why it was that you wanted to have this conversation specifically.
Yeah, well, last year I was on the road a lot. I met with close to 80 in-house teams throughout the year. And I also went to a lot of conferences, which enabled that. And I kicked off 2026 at Global IP Exchange, which is a conference that's really tailored toward the in-house IP groups. And there were a lot of common themes entering 2026. And you and I actually sat down last year. We did a trends of 2025. We looked at all the changes in the world of patents. And I think as we have, gone through what is most of the first quarter here in 2026, it's a nice time to sort of revisit what are in-house teams really experiencing and what is that changing about their priority set? And how, what are some of the successes and some of the really largest pains that they're confronting today? So I think those are the things I'd love to talk about because the in-house world is, last year it was in a period of transformation. This year, the rapid sort of growth of AI, and it's really acute. We'll see if Sivon agrees.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sivon, let me ask you first whether or not you agree with how I characterize your role or what your division does within Canon. Did I get that right?
Yes, we basically handle, it's like, there's like two areas that we deal with. We deal with handling what I call second filings from Canon Inc. in Japan or other Canon global companies where the first filing may have been in Japan or Europe, and then they want to enter the U.S. Market, for lack of a better term, where we will handle the second filings for them. So that's one segment that we do. And then we also handle just about all of the internal Canon Americas filings for our various Canon entities that are located in the U.S. So again, we kind of split it up between them. But we are essentially an in-house boutique. We have over 30 individuals in my department. So again, we're a very, like I said, like on the level of a boutique law firm. And last year we handled about 40% of Canon Inc.'s new filings in the U.S., and we were also able to get about 40% of their allowed cases last year. So we handle quite a bit of work, not only for Canon Inc., but also for other Canon global companies.
So, and that means, and I think I know this because, we've been friends for years and we talk about this a lot, but that also means that Canon is also hiring outside counsel for at least around half or a little bit more of what they're doing, correct?
Correct. Yes. Canon has outside counsel that they use for various other work, primarily handling their, again, what I call the second filings. There is some Canon America's work being handled, but we are primarily handling the filings for most of the Canon Americas, and we've been doing so for quite a number of years.
Okay, good. So that just gives the audience a little bit of an idea of how Canon handles things and what you're doing. And before we go through the list of questions that Fran has really prepared for us to talk about here today, maybe kick it back to you, Sivon, to just give us your general view. Is there any particular area in particular within managing your in-house team, managing tools, trying to do more for less, that it is most concerning for you?
I mean, I think it's trying to handle the workload that we have given the, what I would call a little more limited resources in terms of individuals. I mean, again, we're a very small, firm, but is just by the numbers, we handle almost the same level of work that, of a law firm, which has a little more availability as far as resources. So for me, the main challenge and concern is making sure that we meet all of our, and I use the word client because even though I am Canon, each of the individual Canon entities is considered to be a client. So I want to make sure that we are meeting each of my individual clients' needs within the framework that I have in terms of resources, personnel, as well as trying to help each of the entities meet their goals within the budgetary constraints that each of the business units may have.
Yeah. And just for people who aren't familiar with Canon, which would be hard to believe that there are anybody out there, but you may not realize that Canon is usually year after year a top 5 filer in the U.S. We're talking on the order of plus or minus 2,500 U.S. patents granted every year. So when you say you're working on 40%, you're talking about 1,000 patents issued every year. That's a tremendous volume. I mean, that would put you, if you were on the outside, as one of the highest filing law firms in the country.
Well, actually, you mentioned that Harity has like an analytics of like the top patent law firms that they release every year. We have been this year, not when I say this year, I mean 2025, we were number 55 out of all the firms. And I believe we were also the number one, what I call in-house. But over the past few years, we've hovered between like 45 and 55 in terms of the overall patent firm rankings that they put out every year.
Yeah, there's an awful lot of firms that are higher on that ranking that have much larger, many more employees, many more patent professionals. So you guys do an awful lot with modest resources, really. So you're perfect to have for this conversation. So Fran, let me kick it over to you and ask you, you go off script, or maybe we start with your top question. If you want to react to what Sivon just said, I'll give you an opportunity to do so, but take us where you would like to go.
I think Sivon is really uniquely positioned because he probably has a lot of empathy for both sides, sort of the firm reality and the in-house reality. You're sort of experiencing both of those at once. So it'll be interesting to ask some questions about that. Why don't we set the scene a little bit? This is not new news, but in-house teams are facing a lot of budgetary constraints. You mentioned your bigger challenges, bandwidth, and I think that that's actually true across most in-house teams, regardless of whether they're doing prep and prosecution in-house or not. And so there's this macro pressure overall on in-house teams to cut costs. And I think that has forced a number of initiatives, things like maintenance fee pruning initiatives, patent value scoring initiatives. My first question to you is, in a world where there are budgetary constraints, what is the conversation like with leadership about IP's role? Because I think this goes hand in hand with not just there's less money to go around, so cut the costs, but also the shift of IP being a cost center to a revenue driver. Have you experienced much of that? Do you feel like the conversation between the leadership, the business, and IP has materially changed recently?
With respect to Canon, I don't think there's been a really huge shift because Canon has always had a very high importance with respect to IP, not only getting, but obviously also, observing and respecting others' IP. So IP's been a part of what we call Canon's DNA from basically
Mhm.
the get-go. So there really hasn't been that much of a change. But there is, there are ongoing discussions in terms of, for instance, you mentioned maintenance fee pruning. Is it worth it to pay $7,500 right now to maintain this current patent given its importance to products and things like that. So I do think that there's definitely been a little more of a focus recently on that, as well as you mentioned, patent ranking or patent quality. Also looking at quality is, it maybe somebody does want to maintain this patent, but is it a high value patent? Is it a mid-level, low level? So all of that has always been there, but I think recently, again, because of certain, budgetary constraints or the budgetary environment, some of that has taken on a little more importance where, IP works as a partner with the particular business unit that owns that particular patent. And we just have discussions in terms of, what do we want to do moving forward in terms of what makes best business sense, not only, from keeping the patent for protection or licensing, but also from a budgetary standpoint. So it's kind of a back and forth, really partnership between IP and the particular business unit.
It's interesting you sort of took me in a direction where I intended to go next anyway, which was, one of the big trends I've seen on in-house teams is that they're really trying to get their house in order and create better portfolio hygiene. So some of this is certainly pruning maintenance fees. It's looking at, what do we have for assets? Do we have assets that are in areas where we're no longer investing? Especially with the fee increases that took place at the beginning of 2025, I think maintenance fees went up, and so there's even more scrutiny there. And for top filers like Canon, obviously those maintenance fees really compound year over year. So for large filers, this maintenance fee pruning initiative becomes really, really critical. And I've watched as a lot of in-house teams have put into place much more rigorous and what I would call regimented approaches to pruning maintenance fees, maybe on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis instead of annually, and putting into place more tooling around it instead of just getting into a boardroom and talking about it or sort of trying to analyze it on a onesie twosie basis. I think more folks are trying to bubble the low hanging fruit to the top so they can do more aggressive pruning. That's another thing I've seen. Um, and in addition to that, there's I would say overall been a much greater focus on quality over quantity. I think sort of in COVID times, there seemed to be this focus on more is more and just getting patents was sort of the measure of success. And now it's a little bit more about getting the right patents. I mean, based on your experience, but also I'm sure you have a lot of colleagues in the space. Do you feel like, these are things that you've observed, and is there a focus more now on filing higher quality as opposed to quantity?
Yeah, I think again for us, we've always while quantity is always good,
Mhm.
the focus is really on quality because, I can go out and I can file on everything and anything, but, in the long run, in the end, what's the real value of that? So I do think, and from just some discussions that I've had with others, I do think there's the trend is quality over quantity. Again, just because of potential associated costs that go in hand with quantity, obviously. So I do see that, and I do see that a little more attention is being paid and looked at in terms of instead of doing ones offs and things like that is okay, hey, let's look at the maintenance fees that we have coming up in Q1, Q2, and let's look and see of those do like that, as opposed to like wait until the end of the year or things like that. So try to potentially also, again, from a budget standpoint, is you know help out whoever's paying, so that way they can budget out what they need for the rest of the year, as opposed to waiting and then just doing one lump sum. So I do think I do think there's a trend towards quality, and I do think, again, that goes into okay, specifically related to also budgetary constraints.
So, Sivon, let me jump in here and ask you a question. And you got a couple things on the table here about, quality, quantity, making sure, I think, in my words, that the patents that you get actually satisfy the business units and what they actually need, and the products and that sort of thing. And I'm just wondering how much of this is a specific, intentional, overt conversation, planned conversation between you and Canon. And I know in your case, it's a hard question to answer because there's specific units within Canon. So do you counsel all the different units? Is there somebody who's like just looking at the books, and that, you have this conversation periodically with them about whether or not we want or need more patents or less patents, or focus on quality, or do we really have the patents we need for this camera, for example? Or is that just kind of left to you? They give you a budget and you just decide it on your own?
Well, for the Canon Inc. side of the house that we support, that kind of conversations done on the Canon Inc. side, so we don't necessarily have that much insight into that. But for the cases that we support and handle for our various Canon Americas, and potentially even if we have a Canon global company that's coming into the U.S., we do have that conversation with them in terms of um, what products are going on, and that we will then potentially listen into various project meetings and go and have a good interface with that. Where I'm situated right now, on my floor, one half of the floor is my department, the other half of the floor is an R&D. So, and we've actually been integrated with the R&D since we started back in 2000. That's when our department was formed. So for the past 26 some odd years, we've been integrated with at least one R&D entity. And so that also gives us a lot of access, again, that we can have conversations with that R&D management. Okay, what are you guys planning for 2027? So to kind of give us a heads up. So yes, so we do have those kind of conversations for the cases that we will handle from scratch.
Interesting. I think that this is really the future of practice. I think with the large volume filers, and I don't know where the cutoff is going to be. Obviously, Canon is US is a very large volume filer, and I don't know how far down you got to get to make this worthwhile. But I think with a lot of companies, you could have, for lack of a better way of describing it, a captured law firm in-house that really is sitting at the elbow of the R&D team, that can walk across the quad to go to the CFO's building if necessary to explain things, and then maybe leverage outside law firms, maybe more for prosecution and licensing and litigation, obviously, and that sort of thing. And I think in this AI world, that may be the best of all cases, because if your in-house teams get very good at doing that and using AI, I find AI is great for brainstorming. And that type of dynamic right in the R&D universe at a company, I think, boy, if I was in charge of a company, I think that's how I would structure it. What do you think, Fran? I mean, I know you're talking, are more companies leaning towards this, or is this really just still a unicorn?
No, I think I'm seeing more in-house teams take some of the prosecution in-house. For example, some will file the provisional applications in-house. Some have hired patent agents to do certain work. I've seen, excuse me, certain in-house teams keep some of what they consider the more difficult technology in-house because it's painful to try to transition the product knowledge over to another unit. So they keep that close to the chest. So sometimes when I look at the data, we can see that a in-house team has a number of patents that they're prosecuting on their own, and that those allowance rates tend to be lower overall, not because they're not as good at it, but because they really are prosecuting what they consider very difficult subject matter. And that's actually honestly a great segue into one of the other trends that we're seeing, which is tightening the outside counsel relationship. And that takes on a few different forms. I've seen it as consolidation of outside counsel. So we ran some numbers, maybe it was about a year ago, where we looked at assignees who were filing more than 200 applications a year. And on average, they had patent prosecution work going to 20 firms. Now, that wasn't necessarily, all of their work going evenly distributed to 20 firms. They still probably had, 10 or so that were doing the bulk of the work. But there was there were just a lot of outside partners. And I think it's hard for an in-house team to manage those relationships, be really close strategic partners when they have that many to work with. So there's been this focus on consolidating the number of outside counsel firms they're working with, and then negotiating flat fees to be a little bit more palatable for the in-house group, working with the firms who have shown a track record of high efficiency, so great output, but also efficient cost structures. And so having looked at the roster of firms, say there are 20 of them, you could pretty easily pare it down to 10 by looking at the data and the qualitative impact of those firms. So that was something we were seeing quite a bit of. And also focusing on, everybody's on a flat fee structure for patent prosecution work at this point. I don't even mention billable hours at this point anymore, but really focusing on getting those costs down together. And so I've seen, for example, some corporations go out to their firms and mandate that they cut those fees by 10% this year, 10% next year. That's a very real reality of what we're seeing. The other thing we're looking at is the shift to doing, like I just mentioned, bringing some resources in-house to do certain elements of the patent work. And I've also seen this. This is one interesting trend. I'd be curious, Sivon, to hear your opinion, which is instead of necessarily working with fewer firms or bringing it in-house, actually just overseeing the work with a little more scrutiny. So, for example, an in-house team will make rules around when to abandon, when to interview, when to appeal, and hold their outside counsel firms to those rules, the guidelines or policies, as they might be called, so that they're really partnering closely on cases that maybe are becoming outliers, like they're running too long in prosecution, they're in front of a really difficult examiner, something of that nature. So those are the big trends I'm seeing in the outside counsel relationship and how a lot of these budgetary constraints have sort of trickled down into how that relationship is changing. Sivon, you're in an interesting environment where you have outside counsel firms, you've got your in-house firm, so to speak. What are you seeing along these lines? And is any of that holding true?
Well, again, for us, it's a little unique. For the Canon America's cases that we handle 100% of from invention disclosure till resolution of the case one way or another. We do not use outside counsel for any of that. The only exception is if we do decide to foreign file, then obviously I'm going to have a relationship with the particular foreign firm. But in terms of U.S. filings, again, for the Canon America's work that we do, we handle 100% of it all in-house. So there's really no outside firms that I have to manage or deal with or things like that. For the Canon Inc. work, I'm not really privy into how Canon Inc. handles, their interface with their outside counsel, because if we step back and look at it, realistically, my department is really an outside firm from a Canon Inc. perspective. So again, I don't really have that much insight into, how in-house firms are interacting with outside firms, again, just because of the nature of how we are set up currently.
Well, can I ask you a question, Sivon, about to the extent that you know, how is the decision made on which cases do go to you versus which cases go to outside counsel? And it comes to mind because I was interested to hear when, Fran, you were saying that sometimes you're hearing corporations keeping the more difficult stuff, the higher tech stuff. I've heard the exact opposite. And and it's in a certain context, because there will be firms, and this is all about the pitch. This is a different conversation for a different day, because there's a lot of firms that do terrible pitches, and there are firms that do really good pitches. And I think some of the firms that do really good pitches, they come and they say, look, we've got an extraordinarily high allowance rate on this type of application that will be facing this type of issues. Since I'm software, that's always in my mind. People will say, we've done really great with Alice, done really great with AI. We can help you. Here's our numbers. Here's what we've done. And sometimes then you send to those firms that have that kind of real facility, some of the, the cases, the patron states of lost causes they become, And so it's interesting to hear about the different strategies firms may have. And Sivon, do they send you like the same type of case, or like, are you like doing all the cameras? Are you doing all the software? Are you doing all of a certain kind, or how does that go?
I don't have insight into how Canon Inc., when they sit down and decide, for instance, at the end of 2026, they're going to decide, okay, in 2027, we're going to send Canon USA IP 1,500 cases in 2027, and we're going to send the other 1,500 to the various other law firms. I don't really have insight into how that decision is made. But in terms of what kind of cases, we get everything and anything under the sun from them. People think of us as a camera or a printer company, but we've got a lot of technology in a lot of other areas, and we see pretty much. I've seen pretty much, I think, a good amount of different things outside of cameras and printers. But again, in terms of how do they make that decision, I don't really have any insight. I would think that part of it might be, if they've given us certain cases before, if there are other similar or related cases or family cases, they would probably want to maintain and keep it with us, things like that. But again, that decision is kind of is outside my purview in terms of how they decide that.
So we're going to have to follow up on this, Fran, because this is a real interesting conversation, and maybe we can get some other perspectives on this, because it does seem to me that moving forward, this could be a specific area where companies could get a big bang for their buck, right? Whether they're giving their in-house team the real difficult stuff, or they're farming the real difficult stuff out to firms that have a real facility with that issue, or you give your in-house team a certain piece of the portfolio, maybe where quality doesn't matter as much, or maybe you give your in-house team the piece of the portfolio where you have to have the highest quality. I just wonder whether there's a lot of thought that goes into that. And I think strategically that could be an avenue where corporations could make smarter decisions potentially, and consequently save some money.
Right. I think a lot of it too is, I would say, both structural and philosophical. There are some teams that have structured themselves where they're large filers, but they've got 6 people in-house, right? They can't touch prosecution. They don't have the bandwidth. And they would have to build an entire function around that, which they could do, but it would be a big departure from the way that they've approached IP. And then there are some groups that have had a bit of a hybrid approach, and they've been doing that for some time, and so they have a little bit more flexibility. And then there are folks who, like a Canon, which is, I would say, not the norm, but also really an interesting and probably cost-effective model.
Yeah, well, this just came to mind as we're having this conversation. Let me throw this out there and get both of you to react and get your thoughts. If you have a doctor's office, for example, and there's enough patients, and in certain practices, they are going to have blood work done for almost all their patients. Sometimes every time they go, they're going to want to do blood work just to check to make sure, I think in like maybe rheumatologists who might have you on certain kinds of medicine, or, maybe your urologist who's for men constantly want to check your PSA level and that sort of thing. So what I've seen sometimes is that they'll have like a representative from like LabCorp or Quest or something who is just stationed there at the office, and they do blood draws like maybe every morning or every afternoon or whatever the case may be. But it's not an employee of the doctor's office, because maybe the doctor's office doesn't have enough people to warrant that, but they have enough people coming in that could warrant somebody being there 2 or 3 days a week for 4 or 5 hours a day. I wonder whether there's a model in the patent space where that could work for law firms, where the companies that they're working for are not large enough like Canon to have their own internal team, but they have enough work where that you could have a patent agent or patent lawyer stationed there, and then you leverage the systems that the law firm already has in place. Because in order to make what Canon's doing make sense, I mean, Sivon's got to have docketing, he's got to have backup, he's got to have all these systems in place to manage. And a lot of companies aren't big enough to warrant that investment. Do you think smaller firms could pull off what you're doing, or is there a way they could do maybe pieces of it?
Yeah, you mentioned, that you will definitely need the docketing. I mean, I have a dedicated docketing team, department that handles, getting stuff coming in from the clients and then also interfacing with the patent office. So we have a full-blown docketing team. So yeah, I don't know that a law firm necessarily might be able to handle that. They might, depending on the volume. But you mentioned like embedding. We actually do have, in some cases, we have in the past and currently have an attorney embedded in with a particular business unit to support that business unit, but it's that embedded attorney still part of our quote unquote firm, so they still have access to our docketing team and handle things like that. So I do think that the challenge for a smaller law firm would be if to provide all of the services, you would still need all the resources. But again, a lot of that may depend on, what kind of volume that particular small firm would be handling.
Right. So I think I was thinking about it the other way around, though, maybe, Fran, where you have not a small law firm, but a small company, and they're not big enough to do have a captured law firm internally like Canon does, but they need them. But there may be reasons why you might want to have a certain person attached to them, at the elbow of the R&D team, so to speak, but then leverage the law firm's docketing and the law firm's search relationships and the law firm's relationships with foreign counsel. Because I think, what I have in mind is I think there are a lot of saving opportunities for money and better quality with the Canon model. Mm-hmm. But if you're only filing 50 to 100 applications a year, I don't think you could make the Canon model work. But those firms have budget needs, they have quality needs as well. So how do they deal with this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have seen the embedding model, but more so with the larger companies. And I think the embedding model, I think, achieves what you were mentioning, which is a tighter understanding of the technology, really being ingrained in the company's culture and business model. I spoke to an attorney the other day, and she has a desk at one of her clients' companies. And she goes there, works there 3 days a week. So she really gets it. And so I do think there's a real benefit to that kind of linkage. Can the small company afford that? To have an attorney sitting there 3 days a week? That's also a pretty expensive. To have a law firm attorney sitting in your offices that many hours. It's probably not very cost effective. I will say I think I see some of the smaller, the startups working with some of the more boutique firms. So the pricing's a little bit more accessible, but they still have a lot of the tooling, et cetera, that gives them some of the advantage. And they're accustomed to working with startups. And so they understand that there's a model where they have to go in, talk to the inventors, usher people through not just the IP process, but training them in the IP process. They might not be super familiar with the patent process to begin with. And so that can be a challenge in its own right. So they really are supporting them in a slightly different capacity, I would say.
For a small company, I think, we have an entity. It's not really a small company, but they have their own kind of in-house patent team. But for prosecution work, they'll give us some work and they'll give some to outside firms. So I think that may be kind of along the lines what you were perhaps getting at is a small company may be able to have a small team in-house to kind of help facilitate the interface with the engineers and the inventors, but the action and perhaps even handle some of the prosecution work, but they're not big enough to handle all of it, and then that can be farmed out. So maybe that's kind of what you were kind of thinking about.
It is. And I think what I'm trying to get my head around is some kind of advice and best practices. And I get we're not going to probably be able to do that today, but I think this is a conversation we're going to need to have. And let me plant a seed for you both and also for the listeners. We have our annual Patent Masters program coming up in June. And this is something I would really like to include a conversation there because I think a lot of times companies, startups, certainly, even sometimes SMEs, they get so focused on what they're doing and innovating and growing and moving rapidly that they don't really know exactly what they ought to be doing with respect to the IP side of the equation. And if there was a kind of a pathway that you could suggest, like if you are filing 100 applications a year, you to improve quality and reduce costs, you should be considering X, Y, and Z. If you are filing 500 applications a year, you should be doing A, B, and C, or at least having those conversations. And I think, so if anybody in the audience has any ideas, feel free to reach out to us because I think this is a worthwhile conversation because one of the other things that I always want to try and do is stand up for law firms because I do think some clients are unrealistic. Fran, the 10% this year, the 10% next year, but we want the same quality and we're going to send you more cases probably. That's just not a strategy. I mean, that's just, you want to pay less. You want your attorneys to work more and make less. And, that's just not a partnership. That's not a strategy for success. So I'm always trying to figure out ways that you can work within the client's budget, but that don't require the attorney to have to work 26 hours a day. Because you know what? There's not 26 hours in the day.
That the model, again, of small company having some sort of in-house presence, but still leverage outside works because that's basically how I started with Canon. I was hired by a specific Canon entity that was filing probably 25 to 50 applications a year, maybe in a good year, and they were using outside counsel. But when I was hired, I was brought in to kind of help start bringing some of that patent work in-house. And it was basically at that point, it was a 2-person team, myself and my manager. That has morphed into the current department that I oversee. So it does work.
Yeah, one of the larger patent boutiques in the country, it's morphed into from 2 people.
Yes, exactly.
We sort of started this conversation with the high-level landscape of, budgets are tight, people are trying to do more with less. It's the theme of 2026. We talked a little bit about getting the house in order and what that's meant for maintenance fee pruning and quality over quantity. We talked about the outside counsel relationship and how people are taking certain strategies to either cut those fees or work more strategically together. I want to shift gears a little bit into, I think, what is a symptom also of cost cutting, which is there seems to be a bigger emphasis, at least in what I've observed, on competitive intelligence, understanding where competitors are filing. And I think this comes from a place of, okay, I can't file as much as I'd like to. So the big thing keeping me up at night is my portfolio going to remain defensive? I can't file as much as I'd like to, and I'm pruning assets at a greater rate. So where do I need to continue filing in this more budget-constrained world to ensure that I'm not going to open myself up to, downstream issues and additional costs? I'm curious, how has the accessibility of better data and I would say maybe technology overall, but also just the time we're in, changed the way IP teams have thought about competitive strategy? I don't know if either Gene or Sivon, you have any sort of commentary on that.
Without getting into specifics in terms of what we do or don't focus, but it's always important to understand what's going on in the technical field that you're looking at, whether it's a competitor or not. It's always just good practice because obviously, um, knowing what's out there is going to help enhance the quality of anything that we're going to be filing on. So, understanding the technology area again has always been something that has been ingrained in not only the IP team, but we also try to just have everybody understand. Just it's good to know if you can what's out there potentially. Yeah.
So I agree with you, Fran. I'm starting to hear that more and more and more. You've heard it from some people for a very long time, but you're hearing it from a lot of people now. And to mention something else, I said earlier that, there's a lot of firms that I think don't do good pitches, and there's firms that do good pitches. Talking to the in-house counsel at a lot of our events, and my friends, one of the things that they're looking for when somebody comes to them is they don't want you to just say, hey, I can do the work. What they're looking for is tell me something. Give me some information. If you come to me with some information that I did not have, that then helps me make a better strategic decision, my ears are open and I'm probably going to be more willing to try and figure out a way that maybe we can work together. If the timing's right and, all this other stuff's got to be right, and you have to be the right firm who can handle the work. But one of the things that I've heard several people tell me is when that person approaches it for a pitch, if they come and they say, hey, I don't know whether you've noticed or not, but we've done some research and we know that your competitors are applying in these countries and your portfolio in those countries it doesn't seem to be up to par with what your competitors are. That's interesting information. I think a lot of people in the patent prosecution world just think, oh, they know what the competitors are doing. And as Sivon said, when he first started, he was him and one other person in the patent department. And how many patent departments? I mean, Canon's one off, 30 people. That's a unicorn. Most in-house departments have very few people and can't do hardly anything, right? And it's just a lack of resources. So if you can go to them with that kind of information and insight, it's meaningful for them. It gets you some work probably, and people want to know that. And the other person that I think all of us know, Dean Giebel, he talks about this all the time. I want to know where are we manufacturing today? Where are we likely to manufacture in 5 to 10 years? Where are competitors manufacturing today? Where are they likely to manufacture in 5 to 10 years? Where are the up and coming manufacturing hubs that maybe nobody's looking at? And the one thing he's always said, or at least recently, he said, when you see textile manufacturing go to a new center, he said in 5 to 10 years, there will be high-tech manufacturing there as well. It just always seems to work out that way. So the forward-thinking people are looking at exactly what you brought up.
Yeah. And I actually think I mentioned already that folks are concerned about filings because they can't file as much as they used to. And actually, one of the strategies is often not filing in certain foreign jurisdictions and saving money there. And then they're concerned that they're opening themselves up to a bigger risk in those territories. And so that's one angle. But I think the other is what I alluded to earlier, which is there's much more pressure on IP teams to become a revenue driving force for the business. And so one of the things I've seen folks take much more interest in is where can I identify litigation and licensing opportunities? And there are teams dedicated to this at some of the larger companies, but not every company has like we've mentioned, the luxury of all the resources. Competitive intelligence is a full-time job, maybe for multiple people. You're tracking multiple competitors, And not just the competitors you know, but the emerging competitors coming on the scene that you have to keep track of, people you might not even have thought of as competitors trying to get claim scope allowed that's very similar to what you have. Products that are entering the market, sort of what's out there commercially that might be infringing upon, issued patents that you have. So it is really a complicated problem. It's some of the tooling that exists is pretty expensive. So that's also a challenge, I think, for companies. So if you're a little smaller, you might not be able to afford some of the really robust competitive landscaping technology. But this is a really nice segue probably into the AI question I have. But I think there's some really cool tooling coming out that is helping with competitive intelligence, helping people understand where they're strong, where they're weak on a global scale, helping to translate patents into commercial language so that, instead of the IP team having to do that translation, which is, again, a huge undertaking. Dean, like you mentioned, he's done some really interesting work with this, trying to map. I think I remember him saying mapping SKUs to patent claim sets and being able to tie real commercial impact to individual claims. But that kind of work is grueling.
It takes time. And before we pivot to the AI, let me just also say that those people who don't think this can be done, it can be done. And even start simple, right? We have, you probably have heard Ray Millian. He was for a while chief IP counsel at Volvo. And one of the things that he managed to convince them to do was to stop filing patents in Sweden. And it's like, well, why are we getting patents in Sweden? And they're like, well, we're the biggest Swedish car company. It's like, you're the only Swedish car company. Who are you going to enforce your patents? So it was sort of a vanity thing they wanted to be. And he got them to realize that they were just throwing money away. You'd be better off filing more patents elsewhere or saving the money. And so there can be these strategic decisions that, and if you do what Dean's doing and go all the way down to the SKU, there's a lot that can be done, but there's a lot at a very high level that you could do as well.
Speaking of AI, the topic of the day, I'm sure the topic of IP Watchdog Live, et cetera. I'm curious. Well, first, I'll kind of set the stage, which is implementing AI has been a really big undertaking, but also a really big challenge for in-house teams, I find in particular. I'm not saying that in-house teams are not deploying AI. They certainly are, but I think they have a lot of internal red tape and confidentiality and issues that they need to navigate. And so it makes the adoption of AI a bit slow. And I've actually found a lot of in-house teams sort of push some of the burden of adoption on their firms because they may be able to move a little bit faster. They're also, handling some of the use cases where maybe AI is low-hanging fruit. But for in-house teams, I think it's challenging. And Jean, you and I talked about this recently, where one of the trends I'm seeing is that in order for in-house teams to use AI in a way they feel is safe and approved and follows their AI governance policies, is they are doing it in sort of a blessed environment in-house. So maybe it's a co-pilot or something like that. They've got some AI tool that's been approved for certain use cases. And then they're pulling data into it instead of going out and putting their data in external systems and tooling that could expose them. I think that's the big fear right now. So I'm curious, Sivon, is there a place where you've seen AI is really taking off, it's stellar right now, or where you think it's just falling short still? And what do you think are the biggest hurdles to adoption for in-house groups?
I think with respect to adoption, I think you hit it right on the nail on the head with the kind of again, for lack of a better term, the bureaucracy that theoretically you have to go through to implement a third-party AI tool, just kind of all the potential approval levels that you have to get to, because, people are a little jittery in terms of exposing potentially confidential information to a third party. So that I think is one challenge. In terms of where I've seen it, I've just I've heard things on both sides with respect to, for example, using it to, draft applications. I personally am not 100% sold yet on taking an application and having it written by AI, because from my point of view, it'd be great. I still have to go through and read the application and make sure everything's good. So yes, there is some time savings, but I'm going to have to look at it. One area that I do think where I think it's potentially right now more useful is if you're doing patentability searches, things like that, where, that can definitely, I think, save some time, especially if you're in an environment where there's not a lot of experience in terms of searching. So I've seen it like I said, I've heard and seen pros and cons on uh use of it for drafting. I've gotten the emails, the solicitation emails. Hey, we can draft an application for you in 10 minutes. Like, yeah, okay, things like that. So um I do know that there are some people that are still not sold on it. We are, we're open to it. We're, looking and potentially also, since, we do work with several R&D, there are potentially some, proprietary in-house tools that might become available, things like that, which might be, from a bureaucracy standpoint, a little easier to get through the pipe, than going to a third party.
So, Fran, I think I stole this from you, so give you full credit for this. AI is not a magic button, but I am a firm believer in AI. But I don't think people who are looking for AI to make work more efficient are going to get what they're looking for. If you're looking for AI to make what you're doing better, I think that's where AI lives right now. That's why there's so much. It's so important to have the conversation about what it can do realistically, because clients are already saying, we know it can do wonderful things, so you need to charge us 10% less or 20% less or whatever it is. And they have in their head something that I don't think AI can do right now because of what Sivon said. You still have to review it. You still have to check it. I think AI is an enormously useful tool, but you have to know enough about what it is that you're asking it to do that when it provides you with garbage, you realize, no, that's garbage. That's not correct. And it can give you an awful lot of stuff around the edges and put things into wording that is probably better than what you could have done, or at least gives you use it as a brainstorming tool to be thought provoking. But it does require a human in the loop. It probably will always require a human in the loop for what we do, because on some level, what we do has to be new. I mean, AI is great with summarizing stuff that it knows that has already existed, and still it gets things wrong, I know. But I don't know how AI can jump that chasm where it actually can conceive, because that's really what you're asking, to describe something that's never existed before. How does AI do that? And when it does do that, eventually maybe it will, boy, that's the moment that Skynet's going to go live, right? That's the moment we need to fear the robots.
Well, and I think that, I'm fortunate to have seen and messed around with a lot of AI technology, and there are areas where I think it is so great right now, and there are areas where it's not great right now and probably will become great. One of the things that I've noticed for in-house teams, sort of on that former topic of competitive intelligence, is it's really helping to identify those litigation and licensing opportunities, because again, AI's superpower is that it can go out and it can distill hundreds, thousands, millions of documents and get you insights, summarize them really quickly. I think it's one of the reasons we've seen people use it first for search. It's been great for patent search in general, because it can go out, it can look at these wide swaths of data and come back with clear insights. And so from a competitive intelligence standpoint, one of the things that's been really cool to watch is, as all these global patent documents are vectorized, which is a technology that allows LLMs to look more at contextual search as opposed to keyword search. It can take these patents, it can summarize them, it can identify similarities between them, especially if you want to say, hey, I'm looking at cardiac monitoring devices, tell me what's out there. And then tell me what my competitors have, and tell me where they have it, and then show me where I'm strong or weak. That's here. And so I think that's actually, and it's here, and it's not as cost prohibitive as it used to be. So, you can use simple terms. You don't have to think in terms of CPC classes, for example. And you can really use business language and get those results quickly. And so I'm seeing a lot of teams be able to take what was usually weeks of research and then hours of putting all of that together and making a strategy and presenting it and doing it in hours, minutes. And so I think that's been one that's been really fascinating to watch along the lines of competitive intelligence.
No, I think both of you brought really good points up that kind of go really well together. Is Gene, you were talking about what I would call enhancement versus replacement. Fran, I think from a competitive analysis use, I think that's one where I would probably put that more as a replacement, because that's one where I don't really need to go through and spend the hours recreating and things like that. That's one where I would feel comfortable as a replacement for me having one of my people go off and do a competitive analysis. From an enhancement standpoint, I think I can definitely see AI enhancing in an office action response where, you have it do the first take, but you still need to understand the invention. You still need to understand what the examiner is saying in the office action, and you still need to then do an analysis of yourself of, hey, is the examiner's rejection make sense? So I do think there is a kind of an enhancement pot and a replacement pot depending on the specific task that needs to be done.
And it's not even just a replacement. In some of these tasks, you would never do them as a person because the amount of time it would take to do it, you just couldn't justify it, not knowing that you might get nothing that's useful. But that in and of itself is, okay, there were no insights there in the competitive analysis. But you might have spent a month doing that, or at least a couple of weeks doing that. Now you can do it in a couple minutes or an hour or whatever, however fast, very, very fast. Now, the question that I have is what's causing the tension on the budgetary level a failure to understand what AI really is? And I think it is. I think it's a definitional problem. The Turing definition of artificial intelligence from decades ago is the computer's just operating so fast that people believe it to be intelligent. It's not intelligent. It's just doing so much so fast. Now, I think what we're trying to do with the AI technology today, generative AI and other AI technologies that we'll have moving forward, is to make it intelligent. But I don't think it's intelligent yet. I think it's extremely fast. So fast that you can't imagine that it's not intelligent. And I know a lot of people don't think in the AI world that the Turing definition is correct and it's not in vogue anymore. And I just fundamentally disagree. I think it's the perfect definition for AI. And I think that that's a problem that a lot of clients have is they do think it's a magic button. They do think it's data from Star Trek, the Star Trek computer. It's always right, knows everything. It's either conscious or pretty close to conscious. Maybe it doesn't have feelings, but it can conceive. And I just don't see evidence that that's where the AI is yet.
Well, and I think the way that we framed it is helpful, which is, you've got your replace, you've got your enhance, and then you've got your new, right? The stuff you couldn't have done before. And so those buckets, I'm sure we'll revisit in many times, but it's going to be interesting to watch, what kind of falls into those buckets. And I think right now those replace technologies tend to be in some ways the fastest that are adopted. But all across the board, I think it's allowing practitioners to be a lot more strategic. They're spending their time, less time doing manual data crunching, less time doing manual work, and more time getting to look at the output and say, what should we do with this? I think, for me personally in my work, I've felt that, and it's really rewarding. I love it so far.
I agree with you, and I think everybody should be at least kicking the tires, and I think you should just dive in and start using it somewhere, wherever you think it makes you better or gives you enhanced speed. If it does, good, that's great. But I try it. I'm convinced if you try it fairly, you're going to think it makes you better.
And I think that definitely can go towards improving quality in certain respects, because there is you may be provided with certain information that you may not have thought about or you didn't see. And then you can just take that and integrate that in with what you were planning on doing anyway to help, like I said, not enhance the quality of the application, enhance the quality of a response, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. This has been a fabulous conversation. I look forward to seeing both of you in about 10 days at IP Watchdog Live, but we'll have to have both of you back. I think this was fantastic.
Thank you for listening to IP Watchdog Unleashed. We will be back next week, and we hope you will join us again. In the meantime, please be sure to visit IPWatchdog.com to read all the latest news and information about what is happening in the intellectual property world. And also be sure to subscribe to our free daily email newsletter.